Here we are at Rickner Grange, an interesting site in the Upper Skerne Valley. You can see it down the north bank of the river, just a few hundred meters to the east of the A1M motorway. It's in what I call earthwork country, very low-lying land with quite a few sites, such as the village of Heworth, you can see there, showing through as earthworks. Rickner Grange was a grange of the medieval Benedictine monastery of Durham. There it is on the 1856 OS map, the first detailed representation you can really trust. I haven't seen it on the Tyther Ward map, which is from the 1840s, which could be interesting. You can see a large complex of buildings, certainly more than the average farm. But even from here, you can see that there's a detached square block to the left, which is, as one might guess, the actually main farmhouse with a garden or wood to the left, to the west of that. So there it is, often the first port of call, first edition OS, in this case 6-inch. You can sometimes get 25-inch as well. And in actual fact, this is interesting because Rickner Grange represents a pair of farms. And here I've separated them into red and blue. Not much left of the eastern farm, the blue buildings now. Labeled W is the western farmhouse, which is quite a handsome early Victorian villa. The farmhouse of the eastern farm, an earlier farmhouse, has gone. So quite a complex set of buildings, but these Victorian plant farms often follow quite set layouts, based around usually based around a fold yard. The western farmhouse, as I say, it's a fashionable, hip-roofed villa, symmetrical, big sash windows, central doorway with a round arch and sort of a built-in fanlight. 1830s to 1840s. It's in Flemish bond brickwork, which is a bit different to the usual English garden wall band, but a slight hint of status superiority. It's on the hilltop side. I suspect because of the site, this is where the original medieval Grange house stood. As far as I can see, sadly, there's nothing left of it. There's the house from the northeast, showing an outbuilding, and that the brick's the prestigious material here. The outbuilding is of local mag limestone. And the second house, the eastern farmhouse, disappeared in the 20th century, but we do have an old aerial photograph of the buildings, and there it is. And it's clearly of earlier character. Got quite a steep roof, pan tiles, so it's before the railways, and a whole range of buildings in line with it. So it looks like a linear farm, which would be very typical of the pre-industrial era. And look where the doorway is. It's right behind a stack in the eastern part of the building. So it's almost like a longhouse, maybe in origin. It's classic longhouse layout with the main block, and then just beyond the main block, behind the chimney stack, is the doorway of the cross passage, and then down house, bio, whatever to the right. The whole thing's obviously been remodeled a few times. It was probably about 300 years old, but sadly, it's gone. Anyway, the buildings of the western farm around a fold yard. This is very typical of the 19th century. Linear farms were typical of the late 17th, 18th century. And by the 19th century, they're building around an enclosed yard where you can keep your animals. This is a view looking northeast. Buildings built of pretty poor quality mag limestone with use of brick around the openings, a bit patchy, corrugated asbestos roofs of no great age, probably replacing Welsh slate or pan tiles. Very, very typical County Durham. Here's the south side of that western fold yard, stables or byres, and here pan tile roof survives. So pan tiles usually suggest pre-railways. Welsh slates went all over the country in the 1840s and 1850s, but anything pre-Welsh slate, say, is usually earlier 19th century, if not earlier. You can see two builds there. Again, the use of brick where there would have been timber for lintels. very average quality buildings. Here's that western fold yard from the northwest, and on the left is the 1-2-storied range, and as often it's granaries on the upper floor with access by a stair at the gable end, and there'd be a cart shed underneath. Notice the coping of the gable, where you'd expect big stones, is actually brick. So, large workable stone might have been at a premium locally. Here's that whole group. You can see it on the left. There's the granary with a hip-ended roof, again typical, Georgian early Victorian hip end. And then on the right are a series of more recent brick and stone structures. Then the eastern fold yard, that's probably still part of the western farm, but detached to the east. Not quite sure what the buildings were. There is a range with byres on the left, with brick arches, and then later converted into stables. Farm buildings, the giveaway for stables, there's the divisions internally, the stalling, but also stables have windows. They like to give horses a bit of light. Then on the right here, an older building, probably 18th century. It's a barn. It's got a modern tile roof, might have been thatched to start with. Really quite rough old field stone, mag limestone probably gathered from the fields it's built with, and the central doorway on either side to get a through draft if you're doing hand threshing inside, and slit vents for ventilation, 2 or 3 tiers of them in the gable. And the gables are coped, a bit of a depth so you can accommodate your thatch. Here's the barn again. You can see the more or less central entrance and the slit vents. Now, very often, barns like this, they used to thresh by hand, but in the 1780s, Alexander Michael in Scotland invented the horse engine, also known as the jingan, where a horse would walk around a central shaft and drive the whole thing. And these were built in great numbers. Virtually every farm in the country got one, usually in the early 19th century. Here's the 1897 OS map, and you can see that subcircular structure on the right of the barn, very clearly from its shape, a jingan. It's gone now, sadly, but there is good map evidence it's there. And if you look at 19th century OS maps, virtually every farm has a jingan. Now here are the buildings when a lot more was standing from the 1971 OS map. A there is the present farmhouse of the Western Farm. L is the now demolished earlier farmhouse, the linear farm. You can see the linear farm here for the Eastern Farm. The building I is the barn we've just been looking at. Then the buildings of the Eastern Farm are now virtually all gone, except for this block K down to the southeast. And there are the Eastern Farm buildings, and you can see here there was that had a barn as well, and there was a jingan attached to that, the giveaway shape of the jingan. Here is that aerial photograph showing the whole lot. There is the present villa farmhouse, very nice square building, symmetrical, high status, on the top of the hill on the left. Then here's the fold yard for the Western Farm. Here's other buildings. The barn we've been first looked at is up here. Here's the older linear farm, the Eastern Farm. It's this long range of buildings here. Here is its barn, and you can just see here the ruins of its jingan. So the jingan only sort of survived. And then the surviving range K is down in the foreground here. It's very useful. I mean, aerial photographs you think of as modern, but they started taking them in the mid-20th century. A lot of places have changed quite a lot now since the mid-20th century. This is Bishop Midland, very interesting place. It's on the Magnesian limestone escarpment, a few miles southeast of the city of Durham. And it's the site of an important manor house belonging to the Bishop of Durham, hence the name, Bishop Midland. And looking at the plan of the village here, you can see the parish church of St. Michael's, which is quite grand. And then the old hall now looks largely a 17th century house, could be earlier, a little to the northeast of the church. And then to the south is the castle site. But between the church and the castle site are the buildings we've been looking at. Complex of partly 19th century farm buildings, of which I've not got a great deal of knowledge about to say. The farmhouse for them, against that nice square building, near the left-hand edge of the map you can see. The buildings are really quite complex. And the castle site, well, maybe more of a fortified manor house. The OS map here shows sort of a irregular dotted outline of an L shape. And there's not much to justify that. There's the odd fragment of wall. It's never been investigated in the detail that it deserves. This is a drone view looking down on those buildings from the north. And as you can see, they're a bit of a ramshackle collection of structures. But that main range in the foreground is very complicated. It might have been the original farmhouse. It's certainly pre-Victorian. Could even be medieval in parts. It's standing in such a key position at the entrance to the castle. You can see on the photograph towards the top, there's the platform or ridge where the castle itself stood jutting out into the marshy lowlands below. And there's the north elevation of the range, and it really is complicated. We've drawn what you can see, but to really sort out something like this would take weeks' work. It's got a fairly modern corrugated asbestos, I think, roof. And it's had lots of changes. You can see there's great big doors built into it, lots of openings blocked. It really has had generations and generations of changes. And it's, I say, difficult to say very much about it. Here's a plan. You can see, again, a sign that it's pretty old, a very, very skew gable end. Must have been built onto the corner of a pre-existing enclosure. Maybe a corner of the outer courtyard of the castle, I don't know. That mid-wall running through has been the back wall. There's been an outshut added on the south side, as you can see, with the various slit vents in the wall in between. So I'm saying that I might be wrong. It's very complicated. We didn't really understand it. Good building, but hard to understand. And here's the overall plan. As you can see, it's all sorts of different dates. We've been back to the first two Ordnance Survey maps, 1857 and 1895. And you can see in the blue and the green buildings that are on those but have gone now. And then there's a big modern barn built in the middle of it. What I'm calling the main range is the one I've just shown you, with the possible, maybe late medieval work in it. And then to the north, you've got a 19th century group with 3 yards, all opening eastwards. As a rule, yards open to the south, but here for some reason they are open to the east. And they've got mostly stables and byres around them. Then another range I'm calling the south range there. It's all quite complicated and a bit difficult to work out exactly what the function of the various parts were. Then right in the middle of the main enclosure, a building I'm terming the eastern outbuilding, maybe a little stable. Looks, a little discreet building like that must have had some status. Here's some, again, a useful drone photograph. And you can see the buildings have been much altered, have mostly got modern roofs. These really are a pretty battered collection. But there's still some interesting detail. Those elliptical arches on the north side of a northern yard, and a building with those little recesses in the wall. I'm not quite sure what those are for in the northern yard. Possibly bee skeps, but that's a very possible, possibly. In the West Range, this is the sort of thing. The roofs are of no great age, very simple trusses with, so we call them queen struts and sawn timber. And then there's the walls are built of really quite poor quality magnesian limestone rubble. Then there's a feeding passage along the back with a 20th century brick wall dividing it off from the main body where there would have been stalls. Very, very typical of Eastern County Durham. Here's the West Range, the south part looking south, and again, the roof's a bit different. It's not really king post, just very simple principal rafter trusses with a few upright struts. And here you're actually standing in this feeding passage, and you can see the recesses through which the animal actually feeding troughs would have been filled. And then this little outbuilding I told you about, standing right in the middle of the yard. Not sure what it was, possibly for a bull. Bulls often had a bullpen and separate little structure, separate from the cows, quite understandably. And then to the right there is the rear of that range we started with, what I call the main range, with its possibly added outshot at the rear. Again, modern roofs largely. So a lot's happened. This really is a fairly battered selection of buildings.